How's it going, everybody? Today we're going to be reading some Hegel, Self-Consciousness, from the Pinkard translation. Okay, 178. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself, by way of its existing in and for itself for another, i.e., it exists only as being recognized. The concept of its unity in its doubling of infinity realizes itself in self-consciousness, is that of a multi-sided and multi-meaning intertwining, such that on the one hand, the moments within this intertwining must be strictly kept apart from each other, and on the other hand, they must also be taken and cognized at the same time as distinguished, that is, they must be always taken and cognized in their opposed meanings. This twofold sense of what is distinguished lies in the essence of self-consciousness, which is to be infinitely or immediately the opposite of the determinateness in which it is posited. The elaboration of the concept of this spiritual unity in its doubling presents us with the movement of recognition. For self-consciousness, there is another self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is outside of itself. This has a twofold meaning. First, it has lost itself, for it is to be found as the other essence. Second, it is thereby sublated that other, for it also does not see the other as the essence, but rather sees itself in the other. It must sublate this otherness. This is the sublation of that first two-sided ambiguity, and is, for that reason itself, a second two-sided ambiguity. First, it must set out to sublate the other self-sufficient essence in order to become certain of itself as the essence by way of having sublated the other. Second, it thereby sets out to sublate itself, for this other is itself. The double-edged sense of the act of sublating its double-edged sense of otherness is likewise a double-edged sense of a return into itself. This is so in the first place because it gets itself back by way of sublation, for it comes to be in self-sameness with itself once again by way of the sublation of its otherness. However, in the second place, it likewise gives the other self-consciousness back to itself, since it exists for itself in the other, but it sublates its being in the other, and it thus sets the other free again. In this way, this movement of self-consciousness in its relation to another self-consciousness has been represented as the activity of one self-consciousness. But this activity on the part of one self-consciousness has itself the twofold significance of being equally its own activity as well as its other activities. For the other is likewise self-sufficient. The other is just as enclosed within himself, and there is nothing within him which is not there by way of himself. The first does not have the object before it in the way that the object merely is initially for desire. Instead, it has an object existing for itself self-sufficiently. For that reason, it can do nothing on its own about that object if that object does not do in itself what the first self-consciousness does in it. The movement is thus straightforwardly the doubled movement of both self-consciousness. Each sees the other do the same as what he himself does. Each himself does what he demands of the other, and for that reason also does what he does only insofar as the other does the same. A one-sided activity could be useless because what is supposed to happen can only be brought about by way of both of them bringing it about. The activity thus carries not only a double-edged sense, inasmuch as it is as an activity directed as much towards itself as it is directed towards the other, but also inasmuch as it is equally and inseparably the activity of one as well as the activity of the other. In this movement, we see the process repeat itself, which had been exhibited as the play of forces in consciousness. What existed for us in that process existed here for the extreme themselves. The middle term is self-consciousness, which disintegrates into the extreme terms, and each extreme term is this exchange of its own determinateness and the absolute transition into what is its opposite. However, as consciousness, it does indeed get outside of itself, but in its being outside of itself, it is the same time kept back within itself. It is for itself, and its self-externality is for it. It is for consciousness that it immediately is and is not an other consciousness. Likewise, this other exists only for itself by sublating itself as existing for itself, and it is for itself only in the being for itself of the other. Each is the middle term to the other, through which each mediates itself with itself and integrates itself with itself. Each is, in its own eyes, and in that of the other, an essence immediately existing for itself, which at the same time exists for itself in that way only by way of this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing each other. This pure concept of recognition, that is, the pure concept of the doubling of self-consciousness in its unity, is itself now up, sets itself up now for examination in terms of how a process appears for self-consciousness. It will first of all exhibit the aspect of non-self-sameness between them both, that is, the middle term breaking apart into the extreme terms, which are, as extreme terms, opposed to each other, and of which is merely recognized while the other merely recognizes. Okay, so we've read all the way up to 185, and we started at 178. So what do we have in 178 by Hegel? Well, in the German, we have das Selbstbewusstsein, which we will take as self-consciousness, ist an und für sich, for I, in dem und dadurch, dass es für ein anderes und an und für sich ist. Das heißt, I presume, es ist nur als ein erkannt ist. The concept, and I would say der, let's have a look at that word. English translation of, recognized, established, accepted. Yep. Okay. Der Begriff, the concept, dieser seiner Einheit in seiner Verdopplung der sich im Selbstbewusstsein. Real ist Enden und Endlichkeit ist ein welstig und weltdeutig Verschränkung, sodass die Moment derselben teils genau aus seiner der gehalten, teils in dieser Unterscheidung zugleich auch als nicht unterscheiden oder immer in ihrer Gegengesetzen Bedeutung genommen und erkannt wieder müssen. Die Doppelsinnigkeit diesen Unterschieden liegt in dem Wissen des Selbstbewusstseins und endlich oder unmittelbar das Gegenteil der Bestimmtheit in der es Gesetz ist zu sein. Die Auseinanderlügen des Begriffs dieser geistigen Einheit in ihrer Verdopplung stellt uns die Bewegung des Erkennens dar. Okay, I've completely butchered that pronunciation, but look, I'm trying to get better with my German. So let's have a look at 178. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself, by way of existing in and for itself, for another. It exists only as a recognized being. So self-consciousness only exists for only exists for itself by being recognized by another. The concept of its unity in its doubling of infinity realizing itself in self-consciousness is that of a multi-sided and multi-meaning intertwining, such that on the one hand the moments within this intertwining must be strictly kept apart from each other, and on the other hand they must also be taken as cognized at the same time and not distinguished. That is, they must be taken and cognized in their opposed meanings. This twofold sense of what is distinguished lies in the essence of self-consciousness, which is to be infinitely or immediately the opposite of the determinateness in which it is posited. The elaboration of the concept of the spiritual unity in its doubling presents us with the movement of recognition. So we have the movement of recognition, and I presume this is what we're going to do. The concept of its unity in its doubling, or infinity realizing itself in self-consciousness. So infinity, sorry, so infinity realizing itself in self-consciousness is that of a multi-sided and multi-meaning intertwining, such that on the one hand, the moments within this intertwining must be kept apart from each other. Okay? And on the other hand, they must also be taken and cognized at the same time as not distinguished. That is, they must always be taken and cognized in their opposed meanings. Okay. This twofold sense of what is distinguished lies in the essence of self-consciousness, which is to be infinitely or immediately the opposite of the determinateness which it is posited. The elaboration of the concept of this spiritual unity in its doubling presents us with the moment of recognition. So this twofold sense of what is distinguished lies in the essence of self-consciousness. Okay, let's see what Stern has to say about this. Okay. So let's go to the dialectic of the subject. I might just go a bit because we have the transition here. So infinity let me see. I'm going to see Pippin actually as well. Okay, I think we have it now. So, chapter 1. Hegel on self-consciousness. One of Hegel's main concerns, let me see now, so this is the introductory remarks. It's not going to where I want it to go. Okay, let's read the introduction because it's not that long. One of his main concerns in the revolutionary book he wrote in the German city of Jena, while in his 30s, his phenomenology of spirit is a familiar modern philosophical concern, the attempt to understand the various competencies involved in distinctively human sentience, sapience and agency, and especially above all in Hegel's project, the complex interrelations among such competencies. So there are in his unprecedented book accounts of sensory representativity, perception, judgment, generalization, inference, self-consciousness, gnomic necessity, justification, as well as of intention, purpose, practical reason, linguistic community, and sociality in general. Hegel's account is unusual in that it is conducted via a procedure he invented, a phenomenology, or what he at first called a science of the experience of consciousness. This new procedure, at the very minimum, and somewhat crudely summarized, involved imagining possible models of experience, models of its basic structure, primarily experience of objects and of other objects, restricted to one or some set of competencies, or in some specific relation, and then demonstrating by a series of essentially reductio ad absurdum arguments that such an imagined experience, when imagined from the point of view of the experiencer, really could not be a possible or coherent experience, thus requiring some determinate addition or alteration to repair the imagined picture, and so a new possibility to be entertained. Eventually, such an internal testing of models of experience becomes, in the course of Hegel's development account, so detailed and rich that it amounts to an examination of the possibility and viability of an actual historical form of life, a historical experience conducted under the assumption of such competencies and their interrelationship. So once he has assembled all the materials necessary for a full, adequate picture of such a subject of experience, after the first 5 chapters, he then begins an even more unusual account of the development of such a subject, now a form of a collective like-mindedness he calls Geist. From this point on, the account is even more unusual because Hegel treats the project of human self-knowing or knowledge as essentially a matter of what he calls Geist's actuality. Its historical and social development, and he seems to effect a shift in the proper subject matter of philosophy itself, insisting that philosophy must not study mere concepts, but concepts in their actuality. And that means, in the phenomenology, in their historical actuality, then that actuality is considered in terms of the experimental test. So far, much of this should sound unusual, but aside from Hegel's highly idiosyncratic innovations in philosophical German, comprehensible and relatively trackable in the text, but there are 2 points in the progression of topics where puzzlement can easily become bafflement. They occur in the 4th chapter on self-consciousness, a passage Hegel himself points to as the most important. In the book, its turning point. The first occurs when he suddenly claims self-consciousnness is desire itself, Begierde überhaupt. The second is just as, if not more important, for Hegel's theory of self-consciousness and for post-Hegelian thought, and it is just as difficult to understand the claim that self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. I want to try and understand the meaning and philosophical motivations for these 2 claims in Hegel's adventurous book. Several qualifications are necessary, though, before embarking on such an enterprise. I will mention only the most serious, namely that, strictly speaking, Hegel cannot be said to have a theory of self-consciousness in the usual sense. I will mention only the most serious, namely that, strictly speaking, Hegel cannot be said to have a theory of self-consciousness in the usual sense, or at least that isolating such a theory does some violence to his famous holism. The entire phenomenology of spirit is a mediation on self-consciousness and the coming to self-consciousness of human subjects, especially as a kind of collective subject, coming into collective self-consciousness. And Hegel treats as integral to this account everything from medieval Catholicism to the French Revolution, but as I hope to show in the following, the most distinctive original aspect of that long account begins to come into focus in chapter 4, and that is sufficient reason for concentrating on that section alone. There is another broader reason for doing so, one more specific to the British and American traditions of philosophy. For several reasons, philosophers like Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant continue to have a living presence in contemporary Anglophone philosophy, at least to some degree, and by contrast, what is rather clumsily characterized as European philosophy has very little presence in the elite research universities. One can make a good case that this supposedly divergent tradition began with Hegel and his influence on later European philosophy. There are two aspects to this influence. One has to do with the reluctance of those who philosophize under the shadow of Hegel to accept any firm separation between strict epistemological or metaphysical issues, or even broadly formal issues, from various issues in what is traditionally considered practical philosophy, accounts of action, agency, purposiveness, interpretation, and the like. Such a holistic approach leads quickly to the second point of divergence, one that builds upon the integration of practical and theoretical philosophy, the post-Hegelian insistence on the relevance of human sociality and the historicity of that sociality in accounting for claims of cognitive success, or even in the understanding properly the nature of the basic mind-world subject-subject relation inevitably presupposed in any account of the very possibility of epistemic practical success. There are many forms of such claims for the philosophical relevance of such socio-historical actuality, and what had traditionally been considered strict philosophical issues in epistemology, metaphysics, moral theory, aesthetics, and so forth. Socio-economic matters in Marxism, genealogy and psychology in Nietzsche, mood and resoluteness in Heidegger and existentialism, archaeology and genealogy in Foucault, the dependence of subject on structure, or the disappearance of subject into structure in structuralism, and so forth. The countercharge by more traditional philosophy has always been, of course, that such enterprise transformed philosophy into something else, and so massively transformed philosophy as to lose touch with it altogether. What I am calling the divergence between traditions could plausibly be said to have originated in the turning point of this individual chapter in the phenomenology, another reason for attending to it so closely, even if some violations of holism. The book's turning point, in other words, involved a much broader turning point in the modern Western philosophical tradition, and so is especially valuable in the way it can highlight the issue, transformation of philosophy or a farewell to philosophy altogether. And as strategy naturally suggests itself as at this point, since the topic of the chapter, self-consciousness, together with another to which it is deeply linked, freedom, are far away and the most important topics in what we shall call German idealism. I propose to begin with the introduction of the idea of the centrality of self-consciousness in human sapience by Immanuel Kant, for that is the position I want to show that Hegel is building on and transforming the direction just suggested. So, the following represents a reconsideration and substantial alteration of the interpretation of chapter 4 I originally presented in Hegel's idealism. If anything, I am more committed here to what Scott Jenkins, in Hegel's concept of desire, calls a, quote, contextualist approach, that is working within the limitations of what has been developed in the first 3 chapters in order to explain why there seem to be so many new topics, rather than just helping oneself to an appeal to the capacities of rational sentient beings in general, as Jenkins does. I think the present account answers some of the concerns raised by Jenkins. In general, Jenkins wants to press the point that Hegel should not be seen here as primarily concerned with a further elaboration of the conditions of knowing, but rather in advancing a broad, powerful claim about the nature of human subjectivity as such. That is his new theme. He goes on to deny that this subjectivity should be understood as a mere point of view, insisting instead that it is a corporeal, historical, labouring subject. It seems to me truer to the radicality of Hegel's attempt to admit that he is indeed on about such themes, but in the service of a further elaboration of the possibility of intentional discourse. But another way, Jenkins does not seem to me to do justice, as McDowell does in an interpretation we shall look at shortly, to Hegel's formulation at 167, that in self-consciousness the whole breadth of the sensuous world is preserved for it. It is true that there is a great deal to say about the content of a self-relation in relation to an object before the properly epistemological focus returns, but Hegel never loses sight of it. See also my concluding remarks about wholeness. On the claim that self-consciousness is desire überhaupt, or desire itself, Begierde überhaupt. Kant held that what distinguishes an object in our experience from that mere subjective play of representations is ruled governed unity. His famous definition of an object is just, quote, that in the concept of which a manifold is united. This means that consciousness itself must be understood as a discriminating, unifying activity, paradigmatically as judging, and not as the passive recorder of sensory impressions. Such a claim opens up a vast territory of possibilities and questions, since Kant does not mean that we awake attentiveness is to be understood as something we intentionally do, in the standard sense, even if it is not also a mere event that happens to us. If we happen to be triggered into a determinate mental state, or as if a sensory stimuli just activate an active mental machinery, Kant also clearly does not mean to suggest by this claim that the form of consciousness is a judgmental form, that consciousness consists of thousands of very rapid judgmental claims being deliberately made, thousands of S's as P's, or if A then B's taking place. The world is taken to be such and such without such things being isolatable, intentional judgments. What Kant does mean by understanding consciousness as synthetic is quite a formidable independent topic in itself. I present an interpretation of the point in what is conceptual activity. Kant's main interest in the argument of the deduction was to show that the rules governing such activities, whatever the right way to describe such activities, cannot be wholly empirical rules, all derived from experience, that there must be rules for the derivation of such rules that cannot themselves be derived, or that there must be pure concepts of the understanding, and second, that these non-derived rules have genuine objective validity, are not mere subjective impositions on the independently received manifold, that, as he puts it, the a priori prescribed synthetic unity of consciousness is not merely a condition that I myself require in knowing an object, but is a condition under which any intuition must stand in order to become an object for me. Kant seems to realize that he gives the impression that for him consciousness is a two-step process, the mere reception of sensory data and then the conceptualization of such data. But he works hard in the pursuit of the second desiderata to disabuse his readers of that impression. Aside from some Kant scholars, there are not many philosophers who still believe that Kant proved in this argument that we possess synthetic a priori knowledge, although there is wide admiration for the power of Kant's arguments about at least causality and substance. But there remains a great deal of interest in the basic picture and the nature of conscious-mindedness. For the central component of his account, judgment is, as already noted, not a mental event that merely happens as if causality triggered it into its synthetic activity by sense stimuli. Judging, while not a practical action initiated by a decision, is nevertheless an activity sustained and resolved sometimes in conditions of uncertainty by a subject, and that means that it is normatively structured. The categorical rule, Categorical rules of judgment governing such activity are rules about what ought to be judged, how our experience ought to be and must be organized. For example, we distinguish or judge successive perceptions of a stable object as really simultaneous in time and not actually representing something successive. This is a distinction that we must make. We experience successiveness in both cases and must be able to determine what ought to be judged simultaneously and what actually successive. So let's just read this footnote. To be clear as possible, we do not have an option or choice about the necessary distinguishability in our experience between accidental succession and causal succession. Experience would not be possible were there not this distinguishability. Kant argues in the second analogy, but that necessity is conceptual, not psychological. No concept of experience would be intelligible without the distinction and it being possible in principle for experiences to make it. And we do actually have to determine which succession are accidental and which causal necessary, and that requires the activity of judgmental discriminations. We can thus get this wrong. So, such rules are not rules describing how we do operate, are not psychological laws of thought, but involve a responsiveness to normative proprieties. And to come to the point of contact with Hegel, that is the subject of the following. This all means that consciousness must be inherently reflective or perceptive. It cannot be sustaining an activity implicitly trying to get, say, the objective temporal order right in making my mind, without, in such sense, knowing I am to take the world to be such, or apperceptively taking it so. I am taking or constructing rather than merely recording, because I am also in such taking holding open the possibility that I may be taken falsely. So all consciousness is inherently, though rarely explicitly self-conscious. It is correct. So let's say aphorism 9. Sorry, page 9. It is incorrect to think of a conscious state as just filled with the rich details of a house perception, as if consciousness merely registers its presence. I take or judge the presence of a house, not a barn or gas station, or in Kant's famous formula, quote, the I think must be able to accompany all my representations. But what could we be meant by inherently, or in some sense, knowing I am taking or judging it to be such and such? In what sense am I a relation to myself in any conscious relation to an object? That is, the claim is that all consciousnesses involve a kind of self-consciousnesses, taking S to be P, and thus taking myself to be taking S to be P. But in a self-relation like this, the self is in question cannot be just another object of intentional awareness. If it were, then there would obviously be a regress problem by parity of whatever reasoning established that the self must be able to observe itself as an object in taking anything to be anything. One would have to also argue that the observing self must also be observable and so on. The self-relation, whatever it is, cannot be a two-placed intentional relation, and the self-consciousness of consciousness cannot invite a two-stage or two-element picture. Our conscious sentience, and then, in addition, our self-monitoring and self-relation. As Kant and Hegel would put it, the latter is just consciousness again, and we have not found self-consciousness. The post-Kantian philosopher who first made a great deal out of this was Fichte, and the modern commentator who has done the most to work out the philosophical implications of this point has been Dieter Heinrich. Hegel's most famous discussion of these issues is found in the first chapters of his 1807 Phenomenology of Spirit. The first 3 chapters of that book are grounded together under the heading Consciousness, and the fourth is simply called Self-Consciousness. That fourth chapter has only one subsection called The Truth of Sense Certainty. And that will be the focus of the following discussion. Accordingly, especially given the extraordinary sweeping claims Hegel makes about his indebtedness to the Kantian doctrine of apperception. Okay, so this aphorism 4 here. Oh yeah, 4 is here. So let's read the 2 footnotes. This is quite typical of Hegel's title and can be misleading. The quote, the truth of sense certainty, the Wahrheit der Gewissheit seiner selbst, Hegel does not mean, as he seems to, the truth about the self-actual certainty of itself. He actually means, as we shall see, that the truth of self-certainty is not a matter of self-certainty at all, just as sense certainty was not in the end certain. This relation between subjective certainty and its realization in truth is a key to the basic structure of the phenomenology of Geist. So the relation between subjective certainty and its realization in truth is a key basic structure of the phenomenology of Geist. Its most elemental form is something like the truth of the inner. Any putative self-certainty is the outer, a mediated relation to the world and to others, all in distinction from anything that might be suggested by the title, as in how to explain the fact that of such self-certainty. I am disagreeing here with Jenkins in the article cited earlier. It is one of the profoundest and truest insights to be found in the Critique of Pure Reason that the unity which constitutes the unity of the Begriff, the concept, is recognized as the original synthetic unity of apperception, as the unity of the I think or self-consciousness. Okay, that was 5. Let's go to 5 now. Hegel makes, accordingly, especially given the extraordinary sweeping claims Hegel makes about his indebtedness to the Kantian doctrine of apperception, one would expect that these sections have something to do with the Kantian points noted earlier, and so with the issue of self-conscious character of experience and the conditions for the possibility of experience, so understood. But there has been a lot of understandable controversy about the relation between the first 3 chapters of the Phenomenology of Geist and the 4th. Since the 4th chapter discusses desire, life, a struggle, and the death for recognition between opposed subjects, and a resulting Lord's bondsman social structure, it has not been easy to see how the discussion of sense certainty, perception, and the understanding is continued. Some very influential commentators like Kojève pay almost no attention to the first 3 chapters. They write as if we should isolate the self-conscious chapter as a freestanding philosophical anthropology, a theory of the inherently violent and class-riven nature of human sociality. There are never simply human beings as such in Kojève's account. Our species' status as one of all equals free subjects must be collectively achieved, and until the final bloody revolution utters in the class society, there are only masters and slaves. Others argue that in chapter 4, Hegel simply changes the subject of the problem of sociality. We can see why it might be natural for him to change the subject at this point, for it is a different subject. Having introduced the necessary role of self-consciousness and self-consciousness, Hegel understandably changes the topic to a very broad and different and independent question like what, in general, is self-consciousness? What is a self? What is it to be a being for which things can be? To use Brandam's language, who offers his own version of the change of subject of interpretation. So let's read this footnote 6. There are other interpretations which tend to isolate the argument of chapter 4 in other ways, construing it as a kind of transcendental argument that aims to prove that the consciousness of oneself requires recognition of another. Honneth, arguing, von der Begierde zur Anerkennung. So let's see, on that issue of itself, from desire to recognition, and on the 1.5 pages of argument in Hegel that seeks to establish this, Honneth has a number of valuable things to say, but as I will be arguing, no convincing interpretation of the chapter is possible that does not explain underlying structure of the consciousness, self-consciousness argument in the book as a whole. And I don't believe that Honneth very briefly remarks about understanding ourselves as creators of true claims or the rational individual aware of its constitutive world creating cognitive acts presents that structure accurately. World creating is much too abstract and imprecise a term to capture what Hegel is trying to say about intentional consciousness and its implications for his phenomenology. Okay. 12. More recently, some commentators like McDowell and Pirmin Steckel-Weithofer have argued that there is actually neither a new beginning nor a shift in topics in Chapter 4. McDowell's treatment of the problem is an extension of the development of the one that emerged in the first 3 chapters, but still basically concerns that issue. How to understand the right equipoise between independence and dependence in the relations between subjects and objects. What appear to be the oretic, what's number 7, oretic? I use this Aristotelian term to distinguish from Brandon's term for the cognitive dimensions of consciousness. Erotic because the latter seems a bit misleading, contains a vague thought, delightful suggestion that all consciousness has a sexual dimension, and because Hegel's account seems to me suffused with Aristotelian spirit. See Aristotle's discussion in Book 4 of the Nicomachean Ethics on choice as either desiring intellect or minded desire. Okay. What appears to be the oretic and social issues of Chapter 4 are for McDowell figures or analogies for what remains the problem of the mind's passive dependence on objects and active independence of them in our extensive experience of the world, in just the sense sketched previously in the summary of Kant. Neither independent subjective imposition nor merely passive receptive dependence. What we have is a picture of our active, spontaneous self, is a kind of mythic confrontation and struggle with its own passive empirical self, and struggling at first futilely for radical independence, and then initial but doomed relation of dominance, as if the soul tries to make for its own corporeal nature a knecht or mere servant. So for McDowell, Hegel does not mean to introduce in a direct sense the topic of desire as a necessary element in understanding consciousness itself. As the text, however, counterintuitively would seem to imply, rather, says McDowell, desire überhaupt functions as a figure for the general idea of negating otherness. Admittedly, an oretic issue of some sort, by appropriating or consuming, incorporating into oneself what at first figures as merely other, something that happens in perception, say, and life. The next topic in the chapter is said to exemplify the structure of der Begriff, let us say the basic logical structure of all possible intelligibility, all sense-making. The struggle to the death for recognition is said to be rich, a colourful allegory of the possible relations, both independent and dependent within one consciousness. So where's 8? Oh, yeah. 8 is up here. So I'll try to spec its own. Okay. No, not that McDowell wants to say that this picture of dual and opposed elements remain. Hegel's picture with, at some point, just a kind of compromise or peace treaty. The whole picture, as such, a duality between apperceptive and passive sensible elements or stages, is what must be given up in McDowell's picture too. I want to say that giving this up is part of the parcel of giving up a picture of opposed to self-consciousness who ultimately reach out to some sort of compromise. Hegel's picture is much more radical, and his argument for it begins here. So let's see here. So number 9 is this, and number 10. And life in the next topic in the chapter is said to exemplify the structure of der Begriff. Let us say the basic logical structure of all possible intelligibility and sense-making. Especially The relation between universal and particular is clearest, and there is a good deal of truth in that characterization. The experiencing subject inevitably becomes aware of itself as a living being of a kind, a species from it shares with all other such beings, all sharing the generic form of life, and itself as a singular subject, whose own life is not life in general, or its species life. Thus, McDowell would point out his interpretation is not overly and excessively allegorical. It is important to his account, he says, in correspondence, that life be life, not a figure, something else. The struggle to the death for recognition is said to be rich and colourful allegory of the possible relations, both independent and dependent sides within one consciousness. And so McDowell asserts that chapter 4 does not yet directly introduce the issue of sociality at all, despite the famous phrase there about the new presence of an I that is a we, and we that is an I. This interpretation has a very great virtue of preserving a connection with the first 3 chapters, but as I will argue, while the general issue of the logic of the relation between independent and dependent is certainly applicable to the relation between spontaneous apperception and the passive empirical self, McDowell's interpretation, however rich in itself, fails to do justice to the radicality of what Hegel actually proposes. I want to argue that when Hegel says that self-consciousness is Desire überhaupt, he means that to be relevant to the question of the apperceptive nature of consciousness itself, and that thereby he provides the basis for the claim that self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in the other self-consciousness. Defining that interpretation is the task of this book. Okay. So 11, I want to argue that Hegel says that self-consciousness is Desire überhaupt. Hegel's developmental procedure here requires a general cautionary note. The identification of self-consciousness with desires occurs at a very early stage, as Hegel begins to assemble the various dimensions and elements he thinks he will need in order to understand self-consciousness, dimensions of consciousness. Initially, Hegel is only saying we have at least to understand that self-consciousness must be understood as mere desire. Possible to consider such self-consciousness as merely desire and nothing else, and that impossibility is the rest of the story of the chapter. But this procedure means that from now on, self-consciousness must still be understood as inherently eretic, whatever else it is. Brandom also thinks of the phenomenology of Geist as an allegory. In this case, an allegory of various dimensions of the issue of conceptual content. Robert, the structure and desire of recognition self-consciousness. For example, he thinks that Hegel's treatment of the struggle to death is really a metonymy, the issue of commitment. Commitment subject, of really being subject from apperception to a practical self-conception and self-evaluation. I think Hegel's presentation is motivated by the internal inadequacies of the Kantian notion of apperception in general. Without that issue in view, we won't have a sense of why the problem of self-consciousness' unity with itself should emerge here, why such a unity must become essential to it, and a discussion of a single self-conscious being, certain of its own radical and complete independence. Okay. So here stated all at once is the thesis I would like to attribute to Hegel. That is the thesis that worked out and defended in chapter 4 is noted the entire book is a mediation of self-consciousness and the becoming self-consciousness of Geist. I think Hegel's position is that we must understand all dimensions of self-consciousness, from apperception to consciousness itself, to simple, explicit reflection about myself to practical self-knowledge of my own self, so-called identity, by considering any form of it as in any way observational, or inferential or immediate or any sort of two-place intentional relation. However, we come to know anything about ourselves, what self-relation is implicit or attending to the world. It is not by observing an object, nor by conceptualizing it in manner and intuition, nor by any immediate self-certainty or direct presence of the self to itself, from the minimal sense of being aware of, being determinately conscious of all of judging, to complex avowals of who I am, of my own identity and deep commitments. Hegel, I want to stress, treats self-consciousness as one, practical achievement of some sort. Two, such a relation must be understood as a result of an attempt, never, as it certainly seems to be, as an attempt, as an immediate presence of the self to itself, and it is often requires some sort of striving, even struggle, and all of this even in accounting for the self-conscious dimensions or of ordinary perceptual experience. Self-consciousness in all its forms is some mode of mindedness that we must achieve, be continually achieving, and that must mean can ultimately fail to achieve fully, and once having achieved it, lose it. It is nothing like turning the mind's eye to the inward to inspect itself. Okay, I'm going to come back. I'm fading here. And I'll come back to 14 and I'll read some of the footnotes next time. All right, see you later.